guys. It's so good of you to connect today. Welcome to Evolve. I am your host, Monette, and I'm so excited to get into this week's practical tip, which is about one of my favorite topics, waking up to synchronicity. Waking up to synchronicity. So I have to ask you, have you ever had a feeling that you've been in a moment before? You know that feeling of deja vu, one where we've all experienced at some point in our lives. We very often dismiss that feeling. We may even brush it off as merely a coincidence, and then something else happens and we know that it is more than a coincidence. That seeking suspicion is 100% accurate. This is the point where we've crossed over from happenstance into synchronicity, which I interpret as a meaningful coincidence. It's the instant when the veil between our inner and outer worlds is permeated or dissolves altogether. Today, my guest has a very unique story of ancestral synchronicity. It's a story of attraction, but most importantly, it's a story of paying attention to the seeming minutia that the universe presents in a flurry of synchronicities that led her to her destiny. Terry has long held interest in the unseen. She utilizes her deep connection to the earth in order to pick up on the synchronicities of life. As a university-trained artist and part-time baby whisperer, that's right, she has the ability to visit with children in their mother's stomach, yes, in utero, and request the actual date that they will be arriving. Not the date that the doctors or the medical professionals have dictated, but the actual date that these babies have decided to make their debut, which I have always thought is so fascinating. We all have various modalities, and that's just one of Terry's that has worked for her on several occasions. So now Terry is semi-retired, and she spends a lot of her time hunting antiques and treasures, which have become her passion. Terry is a lover of secrets and all things mysterious. Her life ethos is to patiently ask questions until the hidden reveals itself to her. So I'm so pleased for all of us to go treasure attracting with Terry today. It's so good to get to exchange some energy with you today, Terry. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited about your story because there are so many facets I think that can be helpful to our listeners today. So the first thing I want to ask you is, can you tell us about some time in your life where you have attracted treasure? And what are your thoughts on the practical tip for the day, waking up to synchronicity? What are your thoughts on synchronicity?
Well, I agree with you. Synchronicity is amazing. I've always called it serendipity, fortuitous discoveries made accidentally that have more than luck behind them, more like a directed pull from the universe.
And with that directed pull, have you ever had any instance where it led you into this treasure attracting that you do? I mean, actual treasure, or is it just kind of more a figurative thing?
Well, it's both. It's funny you should call it treasure because I do have a story about that. It happened about a year ago. My boyfriend, my partner, and I were talking about treasure, and we decided to take his metal detector and see what we could stir up. So we went to the beach, and we set up the equipment, and we started to look. But prior to that, as we're going, I was very, very excited, and I was thinking, well, if there's any time to use your intuition, now would be the time. So on the way there, which was a good drive, maybe an hour, I was concentrating on that. I was deep breathing and meditating and being very quiet, and I noticed some signs along the way.
Okay, I'm going to interject right here. This is important, I think, in synchronicity. You said you were deep breathing and you were being quiet, and then you noticed some signs. Now, were these actual signs, visual signs?
Well, both.
Okay.
First of all, I looked out the window and I glanced up as he is driving, and I see a sign for an antique store, and it said something like trash and treasure.
Okay.
And I thought, ooh, that's cool. And then I looked again, and I saw a sign for some business. It may have been a realtor that said Fisher. And that meant to me, had been talking about treasure and Mel Fisher, who had found treasure in Florida. And that just seemed like a funny little coincidence, and I was hoping it would be a validation.
Right. And so you see this sign, and then you guys are heading to the beach. So now you're at the beach, and what's happening for you?
Well, we set up the metal detector, and we're sweeping the ground, and he's showing me what to look for and what to discard. And this goes on a while. It takes a while. And I was having a blast, whether we found anything or not. And as most people know, a metal detector will ping when it finds metal. It doesn't tell you what kind of metal necessarily.
Right.
And we get a couple pings, and we find a treasure of buried Coke cans and all kinds of nails and bolts, and it was a lot of fun. But then we decided to soldier on, and right ahead of us, there was something laying there, and it looked like a dried-up piece of leaf or something that had washed up on the shore, and it wasn't buried, and the metal detector didn't even get a chance to ping. And we looked down and picked it up, and it was a piece of Spanish treasure. It was a piece of silver.
Wait a minute. So you found real Spanish treasure on shorelines out here off the coast, and how did you know it was Spanish treasure?
Well, my partner is quite the historian, and he had happened to work for Mel Fisher, and he was educated in the subject matter. And we knew that there was a fleet of 10 ships. It's called the 1715 fleet that had been struck by a terrible hurricane and had crashed along the coast, and much of the treasure had been lost. Some was saved by the few survivors, but it's still being found today.
Wow.
So we knew that this particular thing I found, it was not a coin, it was not round. It was called a cob, a C-O-B. They're actually cut with tin snips in irregular shapes. It's a little bit bigger than a quarter. And I saw some markings on both sides. One was the marking of the crown of Spain, and the other was a cross on the other side.
Wow,
It was a neat experience.
That really is neat. I kind of have goosebumps. That's so cool that you actually found Spanish treasure. But I love especially that you were led and seeing these signs and having these like little flashes of synchronicity as you're heading out for just a day at the beach, hanging out with your partner. That's amazing. And the thing, in our conversations, I've learned that shiny pieces of metal aren't the only thing that you're really good at attracting. So you've tapped into this power of ancestral synchronicity, as is what I call it, and you've magnetized into your life what I would call probably the greatest treasure, which is your son. Can you take us back to that time in your life?
I can. I love the story. I don't get to tell it as much because I am, a mother, and when mothers start talking about their children, they go on. And quite a bit of time has gone by. It's not a new story. I got married around the age of 33, and I was thinking about starting a family, and I knew it was getting time. That window was closing, and we were trying to figure out what to do. Even though we hadn't been married very long, we both realized that was an opportunity we had to make a decision upon. And there were some health concerns from me and my partner at the time. I had a little bit of problem with infertility, and he had his own set of health problems, and I was trying to figure out what to do. Also, this sounds odd, but I've always been very uncomfortable with the thought of being pregnant. It was scary to me. I don't know why. It was just something that really frightened me.
Wow. So you're thinking about having a child. This idea of children is floating up to you, but it doesn't seem physically feasible for either you or your partner. So how did you kind of reconcile with that, especially with all these doubts and concerns that are floating around in your head. You want a child, but you don't know how it's going to be a reality. Was adoption even an option in your heart or in your mind?
Yes, it was an option, and I'm very familiar with that. There is a connection there for me. My mother has an adopted brother.
Okay.
And he came about in an unusual fashion.
Really?
May I tell you?
Please, yeah.
Well, my mother can remember living in Denver as a small child, and times were tough. It was during the Depression, and one day, out of the blue, her mother came to her and her little baby, her sister, 2 years younger, and said, "Here's some money. Go to the movies." So they walked down to the movie palace, and when they came back, they had a new baby brother.
Wow, a new baby brother after a day at the movies. I mean, wow.
I don't know if my mother remembers it because she had found money and there was none to be given out, and it was terribly exciting, or the arrival of a baby. In any case, she remembers it very vividly. And what happened was, my grandparents knew a couple that were having a baby, and for some reason, I don't know, decided they couldn't keep the baby. So the lady came to the apartment and had the baby, which was not unusual at that time. And the baby was born healthy at home, and the couple left, and my grandparents agreed to raise the child. And that's my uncle.
Wow. So not only did this magical thing happen where your mother goes to the movies with her sister and comes back to a new baby brother, but it was
with a piece of silver.
with a piece of silver. So we've tied in your silver from the treasure hunt. Okay. So with
That's
the
true.
piece of silver, this thing happens for you or for your family and your mother at that time, which I'm sure was terribly exciting. And so a couple comes into their life and then deposits a baby. And so now we come back to you. You're thinking about this. You're comfortable with the whole concept because of that kind of ancestral connection. So how did it come about? Did you go to an adoption agency? How exactly were you presented with the child that you were hoping for?
I had considered an adoption agency, but I had done some research and knew that I would be competing against a lot of people my age that were either infertile or older, and I hadn't really looked deeply into it. I was just trying to educate myself. And then around Easter time, I went home to visit family, and my sister, who's 2 years older than me, was having a big Easter dinner, and my husband and I attended, and she started telling me about this girl that worked for her that was about 7-8 months pregnant, and that the girl wanted my sister to adopt the baby.
Okay.
And she said, "I don't need a baby. My daughter's starting college. Terry, you should adopt the baby." And she planted a seed.
Wow. So we had
and so we started driving home, and about 45 minutes into our trip, we stopped at a phone booth and called and said, "You know what? We've been talking about it. We want to meet this gal and go forward."
Wow. So just a seed planted takes you from conceptualizing the idea of a child to actually knowing that a child is a possibility in spite of the fertility issues and in spite of the health issues with your partner at the time. The universe was presenting all these kind of synchronistic events and unfoldings, if you will, that were leading you right to your child.
That's true.
Okay.
It's kind of amazing. I mean, it's such a normal story for me that when you tell it, it just sounds so much more amazing.
Well, it's pretty magical to me. I mean, it's just very inspiring, but I have to ask you now that the idea, okay, at this point in your life, the idea has taken root. Did you have any doubts about the adoption? Were there any other synchronistic events that happened, or did it just seem...
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.